The final walls between what comic books were supposed to be and what was considered adult entertainment were smashed by the underground comics, spelled with an X, both to distinguish them from their more palatable comics brethren, as well as to hint overtly at their X-rated content, of the late 1960s and early 1970s. The 1960s were a ripe time for social consciousness, and thus the perfect breeding ground for the sort of subversive, anti-establishment work that was produced by the comics artist of the day. The comics phenomenon grew from a number of separate but interrelated sources. It was in part a result of the influence of Mad Magazine's satire and parody, partly an extension of the college and local magazine scenes, which often contained social commentary and dealt with political issues. But perhaps, more than anything, it was a backlash against perhaps the ugliest, cruelest beast of the comic book world, the Comics Code. In response to the growing concern that children's minds were being warped and damaged by the graphic comic books they were reading, in 1955, the Comics Code Authority was formed, a self-censoring agency created by and for comic book publishers. The Comics Code became the moral ruler against which all comic books were measured, and if a comic book didn't pass the code, no distributor or retailer would touch it. To put it briefly, the code was designed to filter out all content that was considered objectionable or dealt with relevant social issues. This included, among other things, drugs, violence, sex, crime, and disrespect for established authority. It restricted how certain words could even be used in the title of a comic book. Clearly, these types of restrictions would never hold up in court, and it must be made clear that these were guidelines. They were enforced by the business, not the government. Comics that passed the code approval bore the stamp of the Comics Code Authority on their cover, and they were seen as acceptable for general readership. The Comics Code effectively crippled the development of comics as an art form and virtually eliminated entire genres of comic books. Horror and crime comic books became taboo, and many war and romance comic books were hit hard by the restrictive code. Numerous publishers went out of business, and although the Comics Code can't be singled out as the sole cause for this, it certainly exerted a substantial amount of force to that effect. EC was forced to rename several of its comic books, create a new line of more wholesome books, and switch the formats of others to magazines in order to survive. Even then, everything they published, save for Mad, eventually went under. Essentially, the only comic books to survive the Comics Code were saccharine, family-friendly books and superhero books, which were allowed to portray violence so long as no actual blood was shed.